The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air as the tiny bell above the diner door jingled, signaling another customer. Inside, the morning crowd chatted in easy, familiar tones. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. A small-town diner with faded vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a waitress who could refill your coffee without asking. The kind of place that felt safe. James Jim Callahan sat in his usual spot, tucked away in the far corner near the window. A steaming mug of black coffee sat in front of him, along with a half-eaten slice of cherry pie he hadn't touched in a while. The man looked ordinary enough, mid-50s, graying at the temples, dressed in a flannel shirt and worn jeans. To the regulars, Jim was just another local, a quiet man who showed up a few times a week, tipped well, and rarely stayed long. But Jim wasn't from here, not originally. He had retired to this small town a couple of years ago, seeking peace after decades in the chaos of his old life. A former FBI agent, Jim had spent his career dismantling criminal empires, negotiating with terrorists, and facing dangers most people only saw in movies. He'd walked away with scars, both physical and emotional, and a determination to leave that life behind for good. Now, his days were filled with fishing trips and coffee breaks, not high-stakes missions. The hum of conversation and the clatter of plates were suddenly shattered by the sound of the door slamming open. A group of 4 men stormed into the diner, their faces masked, their movements sharp and purposeful. The leader, a tall man with a cold, commanding presence, carried an automatic rifle slung across his chest. The other 3 followed suit, their weapons raised as they barked orders. "Everyone stay where you are!" the leader shouted, his voice slicing through the stunned silence. "Hands where we can see them, no sudden moves." Gasps and muffled cries filled the room as diners froze, their morning routines now replaced with fear. One waitress dropped a tray, the sound of shattering ceramic punctuating the tension. From his corner, Jim didn't move. He set his coffee cup down slowly, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The way the leader scanned the room with military precision, the nervous twitch of the youngest gunman, and the fact that none of them had yet noticed him. Calmly, Jim leaned back in his booth, blending into the shadows, waiting. They had no idea who they had just walked into, and Jim Callahan was going to keep it that way, at least for now. The leader, Victor, a man with piercing eyes and an icy demeanor, paced to the center of the diner. He was methodical, his gaze cutting through the room, assessing each person like they were pieces on a chessboard. With a sharp gesture, he signaled one of his men to lock the doors and draw the blinds. The light dimmed, casting long shadows across the booths. The sense of safety that once permeated the diner was now a distant memory. "You," Victor barked, pointing at the waitress who had dropped her tray. "Get over here." The young woman, Sarah, hesitated, her trembling hands still clutching the edge of a table. Victor raised his weapon slightly, and she hurried forward, tears brimming in her eyes. "Lock the kitchen door, and no funny business." Jim watched quietly from his corner booth, his expression unreadable. He sipped his coffee, his calmness a stark contrast to the panic that gripped the room. His eyes flicked to the other members of the group. They were clearly armed, but their body language spoke volumes. One was confident and aggressive, clearly Victor's right-hand man. Another seemed neutral, neither eager nor hesitant, focused only on following orders. But the youngest, a lanky kid barely in his 20s, looked nervous. His hands gripped his weapon too tightly, his head on a swivel like he didn't want to be there. Jim logged every detail. These were things most people wouldn't notice, but to him, they were critical. The nervous one might be a weak link. The neutral one was disciplined, but not a leader. Victor was the linchpin, calm, calculated, and dangerous. "Phones on the counter," Victor commanded, pointing at the register. "Now!" One by one, the patrons obeyed, placing their phones in a growing pile. Jim moved deliberately, pulling out an old flip phone he carried as a decoy, leaving his actual device tucked in his boot. He wasn't ready to play his hand just yet. As the men collected the phones, Victor leaned against the counter, his voice low and cold. "Here's what's going to happen. We're not here to hurt anyone. As long as you cooperate, you'll all walk out of here alive. But if anyone steps out of line," he gestured with his rifle, letting the threat hang in the air. The sound of muffled sobs came from a booth near the door. A mother held her young son close, shielding him with her arms. Victor's second-in-command, a muscular man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, scowling. "Shut that kid up," he growled. Before the mother could respond, Jim's voice cut through the tension. Calm, firm, and steady. "Hey, take it easy," he said, leaning forward in his booth. "You want everyone calm, right? Scaring a kid isn't going to help." All eyes turned to him. Victor tilted his head, scrutinizing the man who had dared to speak up. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Just a guy trying to keep things from getting out of hand," Jim replied, his tone casual. He gestured to his coffee. "I figure the less noise, the smoother this goes for everyone. Isn't that what you want?" Victor's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Smart man," he said, though his eyes lingered on Jim a moment too long. "But keep your advice to yourself." Jim nodded and leaned back, his demeanor unchanged. Inside, his mind was racing. Victor was sharp, but he hadn't figured out who Jim was. Not yet. That gave him an edge, and he intended to use it. As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the diner grew thicker. Jim observed quietly, mapping the room in his mind. The exits, the positions of the gunmen, the distance between himself and Victor. He noticed that the youngest member of the group, Alex, kept glancing toward the door, his grip on his rifle slackening. "Alex," Victor snapped, making the kid flinch. "Stop daydreaming. Focus." "Yes, sir," Alex stammered, his voice shaky. Jim made a note of it. Alex wasn't a hardened criminal. He was scared, maybe even out of his depth. That was something Jim could work with. When Victor and his men started discussing their next move in hushed tones near the counter, Jim seized the opportunity. He caught Alex's eye and motioned subtly for him to step closer. "You don't seem like you belong here," Jim said quietly when Alex hesitated near his booth. His tone was non-threatening, almost fatherly. "What's your story?" Alex glanced nervously at Victor, then back at Jim. I don't have a choice," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They'll kill me if I don't help." Jim leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You always have a choice. These men don't care about you. The second you're not useful to them, you're expendable." Alex swallowed hard, his hands trembling. Before he could respond, Victor's second in command barked. "Alex, what the hell are you doing?" Alex jumped back, nearly dropping his weapon. Nothing. Just keeping an eye on him." Jim leaned back, his expression unreadable. He had planted a seed of doubt. Now he just needed to let it grow. As the hours passed, Victor's patience began to wear thin. The police had arrived, surrounding the diner and demanding negotiations. Victor, however, wasn't interested in talking. He made his demands clear: a vehicle and safe passage, or he would start killing hostages. Jim knew they were running out of time. The police outside couldn't see what was happening inside, and Victor was getting more desperate by the minute. It was only a matter of time before someone got hurt, or worse. When Victor ordered his men to barricade the back door, Jim made his move. He subtly slipped his phone from his boot and sent a coded text to the sheriff outside. It was a signal they had used during his FBI days: distract, infiltrate, neutralize. The sheriff's response was almost immediate. Through the blinds, Jim saw the faint flicker of movement as the tactical team prepared to breach. He had to buy them more time. Victor grew increasingly agitated, barking orders at his men. "We're running out of options," he snarled. "If they don't give us what we want, we'll make an example out of someone." His eyes landed on Sarah, the young waitress who had been trembling behind the counter. "Her," he said, pointing. "Bring her here." "No," Jim said, standing up. His voice was calm, but it carried an authority that made everyone freeze. "Take me instead." Victor stared at him, surprised. "You volunteering to be a martyr?" "Not a martyr," Jim replied. "Just someone who knows how this ends if you go down this road." Victor's lips curled into a sneer. "And what do you know?" Jim took a step forward, his hands raised. "I know who you are, Victor, and I know how this plays out. You think you're in control, but you're not. The police outside, they're just waiting for you to make a mistake, and the second you do, they'll take you out. You want a way out of this? You talk to me." The room was deathly silent. Victor's second in command shifted uneasily, glancing at the windows. Even Alex seemed to be reconsidering his position. "I don't negotiate with civilians," Victor spat. "Who the hell are you?" Jim smiled faintly. "James Callahan, former FBI." The name hit like a bomb. Victor's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his weapon. "You're lying." Try me, Jim said, his voice steady. You think I'm bluffing? Go ahead, pull the trigger. But I promise you, the second you do, you're done. For the first time, Victor hesitated. The room crackled with tension as everyone waited for his response. That was when the sheriff's tactical team made their move. The front door burst open in a flash of smoke and sound, and chaos erupted. Jim, anticipating the breach, dove for cover, grabbing a chair and using it to knock Victor's rifle aside. The two men grappled as the tactical team stormed the diner, neutralizing the other gunman. Alex dropped his weapon and raised his hands, shouting, "I surrender!" His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Jim managed to disarm Victor, pinning him to the ground just as the tactical officers arrived to take him into custody. Breathing heavily, Jim stood, brushing off his shirt as the chaos subsided. The hostages were safe. The threat was over. But for Jim, the job wasn't quite finished. The diner, now bathed in the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers, was a flurry of activity. EMTs tended to shaken hostages, law enforcement secured the suspects, and officers escorted the diner's patrons to safety. The air buzzed with the hum of radios and the murmurs of relieved but weary voices. Jim Callahan stood near the entrance, leaning against the doorframe, his sharp eyes scanning the scene as though he were still on the clock. His flannel shirt was slightly rumpled, and a thin cut along his temple, sustained during his struggle with Victor, bled lightly. Yet he looked composed, almost as if this chaos were second nature. The sheriff, a burly man named Ray Daniels, approached him, his expression a mix of gratitude and incredulity. "Jim," he said, shaking his head, "I had no idea you were inside. If I'd known, hell, if anyone had known, you'd still be sitting in there, drinking coffee?" Jim gave a wry smile, tilting his head. "Didn't seem like the right time to announce it, Ray. Besides, you had it handled out here. I just expedited things on my end." Ray let out a low whistle, his hands resting on his hips. "Expedited? You talked down one of the gunmen, disarmed another, and practically handed Victor to us on a silver platter. That's more than expedited, Jim. That's damn near heroic." Jim shrugged. "Old habits die hard." Before Ray could respond, an EMT approached Jim with a medical kit. "Sir, let me clean that cut for you." Jim waved her off. "I'm fine, just a scratch." "Humor me," she replied firmly, pulling him aside and dabbing at his temple with antiseptic. He winced, but allowed her to work. As she tended to him, Jim's eyes flicked toward the police cars where the terrorists were being loaded. Victor was calm, his face impassive, but Jim caught the subtle clench of his jaw, a sign that the man knew he'd lost. Not far from Victor, Alex sat in the back of another cruiser, his hands cuffed in front of him. Unlike Victor, Alex looked like a man unraveling. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes were red from tears he hadn't bothered to hide. Jim finished with the EMT and walked over to Ray, gesturing toward Alex. "What's going to happen to him?" Ray glanced over and sighed. "Depends. He's young, probably got caught up in the wrong crowd, but he still held a gun, still broke the law. The DA's not going to go easy on him." Jim frowned, considering this. "Let me talk to him." Ray raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "He's part of their crew, Jim." "Not for long," Jim replied, already walking toward the cruiser. The officer standing by the car opened the door as Jim approached. Alex flinched when Jim crouched down to his eye level, his gaze darting nervously to the officers nearby. "Relax," Jim said calmly. "I'm not here to make things worse for you." Alex didn't respond, his eyes glued to the floor of the car. Jim leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I know you didn't want to be there. I saw it in your face the moment you walked in. You're not like them." Alex looked up, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. "Victor, he said if I didn't come with them, he'd kill me. He said he'd kill my family." Jim nodded, his expression softening. "And you believed him?" Alex swallowed hard. "He's done it before. I've seen him." Jim let that hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Listen to me. What you did today, surrendering, that took guts. That's your way out. You cooperate with the police, tell them everything you know about Victor and his crew, and they'll go easier on you. It's not going to erase what you've done, but it's a start." Alex stared at him, his face etched with doubt. "You think they'll believe me?" They'll believe you if you're honest, Jim said firmly. And if you're lucky, they'll see that you're not a hardened criminal. You're a kid who made a bad choice. Alex hesitated before nodding, a faint spark of hope in his eyes. Jim stood and turned to Ray, who had been listening from a few feet away. Cut the kid a deal, Jim said quietly. He's scared. He's not a lost cause. Ray rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling heavily. I'll see what I can do. As Jim turned to leave, he caught Victor watching him from the back of a separate police car. The leader's gaze was piercing, filled with unspoken venom. Jim paused, holding Victor's stare for a long moment before walking over. The officer guarding the car stepped aside, but kept a close eye on the exchange. Jim leaned against the door, his expression neutral. Enjoying the view? Jim asked, his tone casual. Victor's lips twitched into a faint, bitter smile. You think you've won, Callahan? This is just a battle. The war goes on. Jim tilted his head, unimpressed. You always this dramatic, or is it just for me? Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping. You don't get it, do you? Men like me, we're inevitable. You can stop one of us, but there will always be another. You can't stop the tide. Jim's expression didn't change. Maybe, but men like me, we're the ones who make sure you drown. Victor's smile faded, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Jim didn't wait for a response. He stepped back and nodded to the officer, who shut the door firmly. With the terrorists taken away and the scene cleared, the diner staff and patrons slowly trickled back inside, retrieving their belongings and trying to process what had just happened. Sarah, the waitress, approached Jim with a shaky smile. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved us. Jim shook his head. I just did what needed to be done. She hesitated, then added, Your coffee's probably cold by now. Let me get you a fresh cup. Jim chuckled softly. I think I've had enough excitement for one day. He started to leave but paused at the counter. His eyes swept over the diner, the familiar booths, the faces of people who had seen him as just another regular. He knew that would change now. Outside, Jim stepped into the cool evening air, the chaos of the day finally giving way to the quiet of the small town. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, his mind replaying the events that had unfolded, the fear, the decisions, the lives on the line. It had been a stark reminder of the life he'd left behind, a life he thought he was done with. But as he walked toward his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this day had been more than just an anomaly. It felt like a call to something greater, a reminder that he still had something to offer, even if it wasn't in an official capacity. When he reached his car, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Ray. The kid's talking. You were right about him. Thanks. Jim smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He glanced back at the diner one last time before climbing into his car. The small-town peace he'd sought might have been disrupted, but for the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what that purpose would look like yet, but one thing was certain. Jim Callahan wasn't just going to sit in the corner anymore. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.